Welcome to the second Responsible Business podcast from Accenture in Belgium. My name is Wesley Spindler, and I am a sustainability director at Accenture and have the pleasure of hosting this podcast today. Today's topic is one which we feel is more relevant than ever: the circular economy. The circular economy, for those who aren't familiar, is about moving away from our take, make, waste linear economic system to one in which waste is looped back into the system, presenting opportunities for value creation and driving sustainable business growth, a carbon neutral economy, and ultimately creating a restorative future for all. But to succeed, the circular agenda requires a fundamental shift in how we do business. Organizations need to collaborate in new ways and harness disruptive innovation. With that said, joining me today to unravel the complexity and the potential of the circular economy is Dr. Jennifer Holmgren, the CEO of Lanzatech, a revolutionary carbon recycling technology. Jennifer comes to us today with a very, very impressive background. She's the author or co-author of 50 US patents and more than 30 scientific publications. In 2015, she and her team at Lanzatech were awarded the US Environmental Protection Agency Presidential Green Chemistry Award, and she was named as #1 of the most 100 influential leaders in the bioeconomy by Biofuels Digest for 2016 through 2017. Great to have you here today, Jennifer.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's my pleasure, Wesley, to be on and to be able to talk with you about circular economy.
Fantastic. Well, I'm looking forward to diving in. Now, Jennifer, we've actually known each other for a while now. I was first alerted to Lanzatech's pioneering work and connected to yourself about 5 years ago when Lanzatech was honored as a winner in the Circulars, which is the world's premier circular economy award program, which Accenture runs in collaboration with the World Economic Forum. And since then, Lanzatech's also been featured as one of our leading case studies in our recently released book, The Circular Economy Handbook. So I'm very familiar with your journey and your work. And again, that's why we want to have you here, because it's super exciting. But for our listeners who are less familiar with the topic and less familiar with Lanzatech's business, could you just give us a brief introduction to Lanzatech and really tell us a little bit about what you see as Lanzatech's role in the circular economy?
Oh, absolutely. So, well, we do something everybody wants to do, and that's we make beer. But we make ethanol, we make beer, starting with waste gas emissions. Normally, when you make beer, you make it out of sugar and you use yeast to ferment it. We've developed a new bacteria. It's a natural organism, but it likes to eat gases, carbon monoxide, hydrogen, carbon dioxide, like from a steel mill. So very close to where you are at ArcelorMittal, there is a steel mill, and a co-product of producing steel is carbon monoxide. We capture that, prevent it from going into the atmosphere as CO2, and convert it to ethanol. So it's a process that works well. And we already have a commercially operating plant in China taking a steel mill gas to ethanol. So we have proven the technology and we have scaled it, which of course, yay, that's the really great thing to be able to say. You asked me to talk about our role in the circular economy. And I would say that many, including yourself, have talked about the circular economy in all of its many ways. I think the contribution we're starting to make is to say, wait a second, circular economy can be taken back to its basic carbon atoms, and that we need to think about recycling everything at even that fundamental level, reusing every carbon atom that's already above ground to make sure that no new carbon has to be taken out of the ground to make our daily products.
Great. That's a really interesting answer. And I think I'd love to dig into that just a little bit more. You mentioned there some of the ways in which you're starting to apply your technology and an industry or two where it is being deployed. Where do you see the greatest potential for your business and your technology in the future? And can you maybe share a little bit more about some of those successful deployments?
Yeah, absolutely. So our first deployment was with an industrial gas. So basically taking that industrial gas in China from a steel mill and converting it to ethanol. We are building plants across the globe, one in India with Indian oil using a refinery off gas. And as I mentioned, one with ArcelorMittal in Belgium. But we're also doing a project in India with gasified biomass. So we're taking agriculture residues, local agricultural residues that would normally end up as carbon pollution and using those to make ethanol. The other project that I'm really excited about is a project in Japan with a company called Sekisui, where what we do there and have been doing for the past 4 years is taking unrecyclable municipal solid waste. It gets gasified and converted to ethanol. So again, it's a vision of trying to take all of these various carbon streams, converting them to ethanol. And so then you say, well, gee, Jennifer, the world doesn't need that much ethanol. And I would say you're absolutely right. Except I think of ethanol as a feedstock. I think of ethanol as a carrier of carbon and energy from all of these waste locations. You're not going to move MSW, municipal solid waste. You're not going to move agriculture residues. They're mostly water, right? So if you can convert them to ethanol, then you can take the ethanol to a central location and convert them to other things. For example, aviation fuel. We've learned how to recycle carbon waste at a steel mill, make ethanol, and then convert that ethanol to jet fuel. And we actually used it in a commercial flight from Orlando to Gatwick a couple of years ago, showing that you could do this. Just a month ago, Mibel introduced ethanol in their cleaning products that was made from recycled steel mill emissions. And we'll be introducing other products soon. So really, my view is anything you can make today from ethylene, which is the biggest raw material for the chemical industry, you can make with ethanol. And that's what we want to do. We want to displace that.
Those are some really great examples, and I think a demonstration of the variety of ways in which your technology can be utilized, and your perspectives there are fascinating. Now, of course, you've come quite a long way in developing your business model, and you've shared some really nice success stories there. But I'm sure as well you've had some hurdles along the way. What would you say are the biggest challenges you've overcome as you start to scale your business? And importantly, and I think this is important for other listeners out there that might be innovators as well, what are some of those key lessons that you've learned?
Yeah, that the beauty of trying to do something new is you work really hard to forget the bad moments, because if you don't, they paralyze you. So I'm just going to tell you what I believe is the most important learning. And in a startup company, you're always working to finance your work, right? And so what ends up happening is the process is basically you finance the research. And if that looks good, you go out and get financing for the pilot. Then you make that work, and then you go get money for the demo. People call that crossing the valley of death, because the bigger it is, the plant is, the more money it costs to build it and the more money you have to raise. It's a very sequential process. And you could argue that developing a brand new disruptive process technology should take a long time, and I would agree. But I think it's wasted time to have that intermediate couple of years of financing and raising cash. So I think we need to learn how to do those things in parallel. I think people need to be willing, and governments need to be willing to take a little bit more risk so that you don't have to do it sequentially. It can't take 15 to 30 years to deploy a new technology, because if it does, it's not going to have a big impact for a very long time. One of the things we did to avoid that, having learned that lesson, when we went out to scale Lanzatech, we would not take financing unless the investor committed not just to helping us build the demo, but if the demo worked well, committed additional financing to build the commercial plants. So that way we knew that we were raising cash for the demo and we could immediately go to the commercial. And I think that will help. So I think that's one of the lessons. The other lesson is somehow we need to learn to work with governments a little better. What I find is that often government legislation is very much focused on an approach rather than an outcome. By that, I mean, how is circular economy derived ethanol rewarded in the industry? If it doesn't fall into the renewable or the bio category, based on some definition that's 30 years old, it doesn't get the same treatment. And so you're at a disadvantage. You see low carbon fuel standard in California, it's completely technology neutral. So it embraces all approaches. So what I think one of my biggest lessons learned is how important government and especially forward-looking government legislation is in enabling new technologies to get to scale.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things we always come back to as well, and that we hear from a lot of our partners is the role of the ecosystem in the circular economy is really important, whether that be your peers, other cross-industry peers, or indeed governments, as well as the investment community. So I guess just adding on to that point, what do you see as some of the real important ingredients for collaborating when it comes to building this circular economy? So you mentioned obviously the role of policymakers. What else do you think is important to really make sure we are creating great impact in the circular ecosystem?
Yeah, so I would say that to be successful, you need partners that are in the NGO community. And the reason that's important is, for example, we work with the Roundtable for Sustainable Biomaterials. They're a good early indicator of how we should be thinking about what we're doing. You know, they can help guide how we develop a new technology. So that makes them extremely important. The suppliers are important, our feedstock suppliers. The end users are super important because we need somebody with the vision to say, I want that before it's even out there, because that's how you then incentivize production. I also believe academics is super important. The early stage ideas that come from universities are so powerful in enabling what will eventually be a future technology. And then I would also say what I've already said, which is organizations such as yours that are cross-cutting, that relate to financing, are the types of things that help get across the valley of death. We need new business models, and the financial community is super important in making that happen.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more on all those points. And it really is something that must be tackled together. And I guess it would be a myth not to mention our current circumstances right now. We're in the middle of a global pandemic, and that's obviously impacted not only, having dire health consequences, but also potentially impacting companies' ability to progress on their sustainability agendas or otherwise. In your experience or what you've seen so far, do you believe the pandemic has impacted the way organizations are looking at the circular transition as well as how they're mitigating climate change?
You know, that's a really great question. And if you'd asked me as we were going into the pandemic whether I would see a blue sky somewhere in there, I would have told you, oh my God, this is going to not just be the personal disaster that it has shown itself to be, but also would be very difficult for a company doing something new to grow in this environment. But actually, the opposite has happened. And the reason for that, I think, is because what the pandemic has shown is what happens when we don't listen to science, when we don't look at data, and when we don't plan ahead. And what I'm seeing is this tremendous emphasis on building back better, and you hear that everywhere. You hear it from the government, but you also hear it from industry, a real commitment to say, I'm just not going to keep doing the same old thing, because obviously that is not working. And to be honest, looking back at that, I would have been surprised if you had told me that going into this.
Absolutely. And I think I can probably echo that. The amount of, individuals or organizations we've been speaking to on the circular agenda or in relation to climate change mitigation, I would say is accelerated, if anything, which is very positive in quite a difficult time. And I think one thing we see that comes up, probably not enough, I would say, is that the link between carbon and the climate crisis and the circular economy actually aren't put together very often. And I do believe there's some conflicts there between the energy transition and the circular transition, but there's also a lot of synergies. As an innovator that clearly tackles both these issues and is progressing against the parallel agendas, what's your take on this?
Yeah, man, that's a loaded question. So from my perspective, one of the things I see on the conflict side is that a lot of people think that power answers all the questions, and not a realization that carbon emissions come from everything, including agriculture, and that we need a systems approach. And that's really where I think the circular economy contributes, because it's a system view of what to do with our everyday products. And so I think that's an important element of this. I would say that could be considered a conflict. I also think there's a false conflict created between new approaches. If we have one, we can't have the other. Our planet's on fire. We have 7 years to prevent us from exceeding 1.5, 25 years in exceeding 2. We got to do something, and we got to do something now, which means welcome all is the answer. Please come sit at the table and contribute. And to me, that is another conflict that really shouldn't even be there. And I would say then the last thing that I always see as a barrier that stands in the way is what I would call the perfect has to be the enemy of the good, or the perfect is the enemy of the good. We're always looking for the perfect solutions, like the vaccine. But we already know masks are just as useful as vaccines. So why are we betting on a vaccine and not looking at a mask and how we can utilize it? I think we get ourselves into these long-term views only, or focus on the long-term views. And I think actually by only hoping for the perfect, we end up actually helping the status quo. Because as long as there are no solutions, all we have is what we have today. And I think this is really, really dangerous. Now, on the flip side, I do believe there's a million solutions out there. A lot of people talking about how to tackle every aspect of this, from consumers to the entire supply chain. And actually, what's really interesting is, I don't know if you saw the announcement of the Great Reset recently. I continue to see companies trying to lead change. And as long as the business community, I feel, is leading change, I think that will be very impactful, because nobody can argue that the economics don't work, or that the economics are more important than the ESG elements. So I'm really excited to see so many businesses saying, I am not making a 2050 target, I'm making a 2030 target. We have to do something. We have to do it now. So I think that's a long answer, Wesley. I'm sorry for that.
But it's a great answer. And I think, you called out a couple really important things. Obviously, the importance of having, a stake in the ground and that vision, but also being practical about what you can do now to make that incremental shift. Because I think I would also agree you need both the incremental shifts as well as some of those big, bold, transformational changes that do take longer. So I think you really hit it home there. And I guess that leads me to probably my last question. you as a leader and Lanzatech as a real pioneering company with such a transformational solution, you obviously have a very critical and important role to play that you are executing against in relation to the circular agenda, the energy transition agenda. But there's a lot of organizational leaders or other listeners out there who may be learning about this topic and learning about some of these solutions that don't really know where to start. What would be your advice or perhaps your call to action to those groups in terms of how they can get involved, where they begin, and really where they should put some of that energy, as you referenced in your previous response?
If I were to think about what a call to action would be, or my call to action would be, I think the first bit of that is to remember and to listen to the science. We really need to do something, and we need to do it quickly. And every act can be reinforcing or it can be negative. And so what I would say to each and every one of you is just evaluate everything you're doing and figure out how can you reduce your footprint on this planet. I would then overlay that with how you can come together, how we can all come together and do something that positively impacts our carbon footprint. And that is where technology solutions come in. That's where governments come in. That is where financing community comes in. We all have something we can contribute in our daily lives, but more importantly, as a community, to drive and create big change. So if I were to dive in, I'd look around and I would ask myself, how can I contribute as an individual? How can I get my company to contribute? And then who do I work with to make something happen? But the last thing I would also say is, beyond listening to the science, listening to what the customer is saying. I'm really amazed and impressed by how many people are saying, we need to do something and I want to be part of the solution. And I think we've all realized circular carbon, the circular economy, is what's going to get us there. We cannot afford to throw the Earth's valuable resources away. So I will leave it at that.
Well, I think that's perfect. Very powerful words to end on, for sure. Jennifer, that was really insightful. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with the audience, for taking the time to speak to us today. And absolutely, we look forward to seeing where Lanzatech is going next with your pioneering work. I mean, I've been a true believer since back in 2015, and I'm sure others following this podcast will be interested to hear where you go. So thanks to you very much for participating.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you to everyone listening today to this Responsible Business podcast on the circular economy. To discover more about this topic, please visit the Accenture Bellux blog for related articles, and make sure that you join us next week when we talk about the leadership transition.